So hello everyone. Today we have to finish on time, so we're gonna start. Welcome from me once again. My name is Joanna. I'm one of the organizers of the paper team. My pronouns are she, her. For accessibility reasons, we're gonna be using visual descriptions of ourselves. So I'm Mediterranean white with brown hair and eyes. I'm wearing a salmon t-shirt, a black cardigan, and I'm currently sitting in the kitchen. Also, for accessibility reasons, we would like to encourage everyone to speak loud and clear when asking questions. We're very much looking forward to this fourth and final seminar of the paper series on the ethics and politics of representation. To access recordings of the previous ones and to learn more about the project, you can head to our website, which is put in the chat now. In this seminar, we will follow a conversational model yet again, like the one we had last Friday. So instead of two separate presentations, our speakers, Elena and Julia, who we're very pleased to host tonight, will engage in a conversation guided by our chair, Rick Adrians, and your own questions. Before handing over to Victoria, who will give a bit more information on tonight's topic, and then hand over to Rick to start, we wanted to say a big thank you to Emily for putting our various conversations together and proposing to undertake this project. Also to Alice for becoming an integral member of the team, to Charlie that couldn't be with us tonight, to all the speakers and chairs that have joined us so far, to all the attendees for their amazing questions, and also to all the students in our department that are helping out with the seminar transcriptions, which hopefully will be uploaded on the website next week as well. And finally, also to our department's anti-racism committee for endorsing it and for supporting us throughout. Victoria, to you.
Thanks, Joanna, and hi, everybody. At the moment, I think we've got something like 100 people on the call at this point. So my name is Victoria. My pronouns are she and her, and I am a white woman with long brown hair, green eyes, and I'm wearing a burgundy turtleneck. I've got a big green plant behind me as well. So to help frame this evening's discussion, this seminar's focus is going to be the ethics and politics of representation. So we're going to be discussing things like omission and inclusion, accountability, responsibility, and positionality. And thanks again for Julia and Elena, our speakers, who are going to be sharing their thoughts and time with us today. Before getting started, I'm going to introduce Rick, who is our chair for the evening. So Rick Adrians is a lecturer in digital anthropology at UCL. He acquired his PhD from Central European University in 2018 with a doctoral thesis on transnational media and the politics of recognition in Armenia and the Armenian diaspora. His work on media, music, post-socialist transformation, and diaspora has been published in journals such as Social Analysis, Identities, Nationalities Papers, and Caucasus Survey. His current research explores the entanglements of digital youth culture, state propaganda, and liberalism in Hungary. So Rick, thank you as well, and I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you very much, everyone, for inviting me to chair this session. It's really a great honor, and I'm especially excited to work on this, to chair this session on representation, which is really close indeed also to my own interests. So before we are going to start the conversation, I'd just like to mention briefly a couple of housekeeping issues that are really important for the seminar as it unfolds, and that those are the following issues. First of all, I just want to mention that there is no room for racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and classism in these seminars. Marginalized folk are not under an obligation to educate you during these seminars or to comfort you, and we ask you to be mindful of any assumptions that you make about others who are present at the events. We will have two moderators here, one who's managing the live chat, and they will be there if any issues arise. The series is also being recorded, and will be available on our website after the fact. And I would also like to point to your awareness the content warning that there may be distressing or uncomfortable content here in this series, and we might address examples such as microaggressions or intergenerational trauma and various forms of violence that emerge as a result of our discipline's colonial history. I just realized I forgot to also to introduce myself. So my pronouns are he, him. I'm a white man with curly blonde hair, a mustache. I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf, and I wear a black and white striped sweater. Sorry for not mentioning that first. Yes, for today's housekeeping, further thing to keep in mind is that if you want to ask a question, you can simply use the raise your hand function, and then I will call your name, and someone from the paper team, one of the others, will then unmute your microphone. And if you can also ask a question anonymously, which perhaps for certain reasons you may prefer. Then you can use the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. And then someone from the paper team will raise their hand and read your question to the speakers. So it's really as was already mentioned, it's an open dialogue really. So if you feel that you have a question, you can you're really encouraged to raise it. And again, yes, make sure that you for accessibility reasons that you describe yourself, and also that you speak loud and clearly. I will now introduce the two speakers who we're really excited to have for today. The first speaker we have is Professor Elena Fiddian-Qasmiyeh, who is a professor in Migration and Refugee Studies in the Geography Department at UCL. And she's the co-director of the UCL Migration Research Unit, and also founder and director of the research network at the Institute of Advanced Studies that is called Refuge in a Moving World. She's leading a number of research projects and has also published widely on themes related to migration and refugee studies, including research projects include local community experiences and responses to displacement from Syria. She's also joint lead of the Badawi Camp Lamp as part of the HRC Network Plus program, Imagining Futures Through Unarchived Pasts. Elena's work is, as we will notice in the debate, is very much interested in debates surrounding refugee-led and Southern-led responses to forced migration, and also, which is especially important for today's subject and theme, very much engaged in issues related to the politics of knowledge production vis-a-vis displacement. So we'll definitely be going into that. Our second speaker is Julia Sauma, who is well known to many of us in UCL anthropology, where she taught before she joined Goldsmiths. She's a Brazilian, British, and deaf anthropologist whose research explores politically nuanced studies of collective life, maintained within and against violent legal, political, and relational structures. She has worked in Brazil with street children and educators, and with Amazonian quilombolas, Maroons, on race and ethnicity, political cosmology and ecology, myth, memory, kinship, gender, and the body. Her work also explores issues related to efforts to maintain a vital collective life in the face of and against anti-Black ideologies and state-endorsed environmental destruction in the Brazilian Amazon. And her work also very much reflects on personal experiences of racial, gender, and disability discrimination, and the importance of miscommunication in the making of anthropological knowledge. So that's also, again, I think, very much an issue that that we'll have a chance to explore more today, hopefully. So, as this is very much an open, really a conversation and a debate where you are very much invited to also to participate, I'm just going to kind of few opening questions to kind of get the conversation going, but we can really see where it goes. Yeah, we will see where this leads us. But I think as a kind of opening question that I would like to ask to both of our speakers, I would like to ask, how do you see the role of representation in scholarly knowledge production more generally? Like, are we creating representations of the world, or we're also creating representations in the world? Of course, the representations of the world we create, they also have an effect on the world that we study. So how do you see this relation between representations of the kind of worlds that we look at and the impact of those representation on the people we study? It's a very broad opening question, but I'd be very curious. I don't know who of you feels tempted to start. Julia, would you like to start?
Yeah, why not? I can have a go at starting. I'm sorry if my internet cuts out a little bit. I just wanted to start by saying thank you for the invitation to be here. I haven't been seeing my former UCL colleagues for a really long time, so it's really nice to catch up after such a tumultuous year. My name is Julia Sauma. My pronouns are she, her. I am a Latin American woman of mixed non-Black heritage, and I am wearing a red jumper and I am sitting in my living room. In terms of the question of representation and what representations do, I was thinking more in terms of the kind of effect that academic representations have or can have on the world, or what kind of worlds we're creating with academic representations and the power of academic representation. I think the place that I would start is by reflecting on the different ways in which academic or scholarly work impacts the world in different places. The UK, you have a certain setup, but that's not the case all over the world. Scholarly production and the effect of scholarly production is very different in Brazil than what it is here. And so I think it's really important for us to start from that place, from acknowledging that there are different ways in which scholarly production impacts the world in different places. In Europe and UK, which is what I know best, there's a certain kind of often a certain kind of distance between scholarly production and the world and politics. But that's not so much the case in Brazil and in Latin America generally, where you have many more influential, public scholars, but also anthropologists, particularly who are working, in government agencies or alongside government agencies in lots of different ways, and particularly with indigenous and Maroon communities in the Amazon region. So I think that is, a really kind of like important thing for us to take into account when we start having these kinds of conversations. And then, we can turn to the question of, what kind of impact that we have, and the kind of different kind of circles, concentric circles, or however we want to imagine it, that we have, in terms of the impact that we have on each other within scholarly circles, and within academic departments, and then, on the communities and the people that we're working with on a long-term basis, and also in relation to policy and politics, because that does happen. Often we like to think of and even protect ourselves with this idea that, we don't have that much impact and our ideas just trickle down or something like that, but that's not actually the case. We are creating powerful worlds, I think, through our writing, and we have to take that into account when we're writing. So I guess I'll start and stop there for now.
Great.
Thank you, Juliet. Rick, shall I introduce myself?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So I'm Elena Fiddian-Qasmiyeh. My pronouns are she, her, and I am white, female with light brown curly hair, red glasses and a yellow shirt, and I'm calling from my bedroom. Thank you very much for having me here. Absolutely, as Julia has said, the expectations of the relationship between academic knowledge production and impact on the real world, whatever that is and however it's constructed by different actors, stakeholders, or whatever terminology we want to use, is a very contested one. So we can find examples of academics who, for example, in my field in refugee studies, who have demarcated the actual limits and extent of a particular refugee population. So Barbara Harold-Bond, who's the grandmother of refugee studies, when she visited the Sahrawi refugee camps in southwest Algeria, which is where I've done a lot of my research in the past, she told UNHCR that there were 125,000 refugees on the basis of her very short visit in the camp and her estimation. And her knowledge, as it was consumed by UNHCR, became fact and became the basis for policies and programs. So some academics have access to the production of knowledge in a way that it is taken as fact and subsequently becomes the foundation of real life policies and programs, which often lead to discriminatory effects on populations, on people in different situations. And yet, although we might hear many academics saying that they don't have an impact and that there's that trickle down, at the same time, there are many academics who would say and would be encouraged in grant applications, for example, to demonstrate their track record of influencing governmental and UN agency decision-making and practice. And there is that expectation in particular academic spheres, including in the British one, that you are a good academic if you are engaging in knowledge exchange activities, you're engaging in outreach, and you are having an impact on the real world rather than reproducing those conversations within the ivory tower, etc. And that is dangerous in many regards because it ties into white savior complexes, the expectation that that research is only valid if it does have an impact, a direct, traceable, evidence-based impact on public perceptions, on political and policy frameworks, etc., leaving a more complicated framework in terms of the less valued forms of knowledge production that might actually be more destabilizing, more critical of the status quo, and in fact providing alternative entry points to different understandings of the world around us. So many of you will be aware of a current crisis in the UK funding world, which is that the UK RI, which is the key funding body in the UK, has had its ODA funding, its overseas development aid funding, slashed, and academics who've been funded by the GCRF, in that world of multiple acronyms, they're having a lot of projects cancelled midway. Projects are being terminated, projects are being cancelled because of government directed funding. So this is funding for academics coming through the government, which is leading to a number of projects being cut. And the argument that is being made is that real people's lives will be lost, that people will die because research isn't able to continue. Now, this is, I think there are many reasons why we should challenge the cut to funding, including the fact that the money that was going to research is now being diverted to funding nuclear arms. So that is the kind of the element that needs to be critiqued, I think. But the expectation and the declarations that research is being undermined and that people will die as a result, I think is a very problematic one in terms of how we think about, well, really, what is the impact of our research? And is that the only way that our research can be valued if you are actually undertaking that life-saving research, etc. So Julia, I don't know if you want to come back to that, or Rick, if you want to interject and direct us in a different direction.
Yeah, I was just wanted to pick up on something that you were talking about, which is in terms of, you know, anthropologists and how anthropologists demarcate. I think that's a really important thing for us to talk about in terms of the impact of anthropological work. This, you know, idea of demarcation, which actually, you know, connects to actual physical demarcation, right? So in Brazil, anthropologists are responsible and have to participate in the demarcation of indigenous lands and maroon lands, okay? So you have the kind of like the political and actual implementation of policy in which anthropologists are involved in. But also sort of demarcating geographies and who belongs in certain places and who doesn't belong in certain places, which is something that is, you know, really significant in the Amazon region. You know, I work with Black communities in the Amazon region, and one of the things that a lot of people said to me when I first started working there was, well, you know, the thing is, people think that we're not here, that we don't exist, because the indigenous, that the Amazon isn't just an indigenous space, which is not to take away from the significance of, you know, indigenous fights for life and crisis and the genocide of indigenous people in the Amazon, but as also alongside the kind of silencing that takes place when anthropologists, and these are geographies created by anthropologists within the national imaginary, right, of what Brazil is and where people are located and where they belong, that I think is really, really important for us to think about. You know, the idea of racial democracy that you have in Brazil is profoundly based on anthropological and sociological studies of where people belong and how people have come together and how they have mixed. And it's something that has been, you know, underlying the idea that racism doesn't exist in Brazil for a very, very long time, and a process of whitening at the same time. So I think I just wanted to pick up on that, because I think that's really important for us to think about conceptual demarcations, physical demarcations, geographical demarcations that anthropological works do, you know, and then for us to, you know, and reflect also on what, Elena, you're picking up on this kind of opposition between the ivory tower and impact-based work, which is really, really problematic, as if on the one hand, impact-based is unproblematic and something to be, you know, run after constantly and espoused persistently, and that as if that's kind of the place where ethical work takes place, in opposition to ivory, which is ivory tower, which is where only theory takes place that doesn't have an impact on the world, and where, you know, people don't have to worry so much about ethics. And I think that that's an opposition that we really have to challenge constantly.
Absolutely. And I think one of the challenges that arises when there is that push for impact, and that there is that push for having a key influence on contemporary policy is that there is this reproduction of the presentist bias that we see in policy within academic studies. So people who are running behind the funding, especially when there are emergency calls for grants or when there are impact calls for grants, which directly tie the allocation of funding to addressing today's problems, is that we forget the historical. We are forced to repress the historical structures of violence and oppression that have led to the contemporary, the present day moment, crisis, etc. So absolutely that presentist bias, and also the reproduction of particular fields, particular field sites or communities as the ideal interlocutors for research projects, populations that have been identified as being welcoming of researchers versus those who have been more reluctant. So how the research cycle, as you say, kind of documents potentially the existence of particular people and their particular struggles, representing them in one particular way, whilst other people or groups who are considered to be less attractive, less open to sympathy, for example, are not explored on their own terms, or are not included in particular debates. I think is also an important way of opening up that thought process, at least.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. A lot to unpack there. We're already getting some. I already see one question in the Q&A that I will get to in a bit. But one thing that I've really struck me in some of the things that you were mentioning is the kind of ambiguous role that academics can have in providing almost a kind of existential validation for the people we study, for instance, for policymakers, governments, like by creating certain knowledge and certain, it's as if these people, usually marginalized groups, as if they do not exist without us representing them. But at the same time, us meaning the anthropologist or the geographer, how do you deal with that responsibility as a researcher? How, because of course the problem is that groups are inherently diverse and have conflicting ideas about what the collectivity, what it means. Something I noticed also in my own work with diaspora communities, that often the organizations who are meant to represent the whole do not necessarily have the legitimacy of everyone they're supposed to represent. Is this a dilemma that you have faced in your own work, and if so, do you have any insights to share? Elena, perhaps?
Sure, thank you. I'll stick with the Sahrawi refugee situation, which is the Sahrawi refugee camps in southwest Algeria, where I conducted my my doctoral research way back when, and where there has effectively been what I call a system of representation. So systems whereby particular voices become hyper audible and particular discursive frames become hyper visible. So in this context, the policy world, whether it's UNHCR, the media, NGOs such as Oxfam, and academics such as Barbara Harold-Bond, who I cited earlier, have represented the camps, especially since the 1980s, as ideal spaces characterized by full gender equality and a total absence of violence against women. And this is an image, a fact that has been produced by that repetition by the UN, by Oxfam, by academics, by the media, etc., has become a fact which has then been reproduced subsequently, has been consumed and then subsequently reproduced by many academics. And what I found in my own research was the extent to which engaging critically with that discursive framework positions particular researchers as good or as bad researchers. So I have experienced being pushed back and pushed out by certain academics who consider that it is problematic to engage critically with that representational structure, precisely because it is the foundation of humanitarian aid provision, because the ideal refugees, which is what I've explored in my PhD and in my book, The Ideal Refugees, that framework is precisely the foundation for that humanitarian assistance and for political support for the struggle for self-determination. So there is a lot at stake through that discursive representation. That discourse creates the reality which has real impacts in the world. And yet, from my perspective, engaging critically with that discursive framework is an ethical standpoint, precisely because it reproduces particular systems of epistemic violence, because it pictures one group of refugees as being ideal precisely by counterposing them or contrasting them with the bad refugees who aren't gender equal, free from violence against women, and tie into particular frameworks and stereotypes relating to gender and religion in particular within that framework of religion. So in that context, political representatives create and reproduce discursive frameworks which have important political functions from their own perspective, but also lead to discrimination against the non-ideal refugees within those refugee camps, and also are degrading towards other people who don't fit into that particular frame of reference. So there, an academic such as myself, who has not reproduced but has rather critiqued those very frequently used terms, has in turn been identified as a bad researcher because my research hasn't been identified as being fully in solidarity with the camps or with the political discourse in the camps. And I debated that a great deal within the context of my dissertation, of my PhD, of whether it was the ethical or unethical thing to do to actually critically engage with that system of power. And what I decided was that I had an ethical commitment, as it were, to people in the camp rather than to the political leadership, and that engaging carefully with that discourse was indeed an ethical thing to do. But as I say, that kind of led to me being firstly expelled from the camps and not allowed to return, and secondly to other academics disagreeing and arguing that no, because it's an ongoing conflict situation, one shouldn't rock the boat. So you shouldn't say, well, actually, there is violence against women, because there's violence against women in all societies, and it's difficult to argue anything to the contrary, and that indeed gender relations are not fully equal, which is the system that has been reproduced in those ways. So I think that there are key questions that arise with reference to representational structures and representatives, and then those questions around, well, who does one have an ethical relationship with and towards? And for me, I've struggled on different occasions and, well, throughout different processes with reference to those decisions. And for me, the extent to which slowly women from the camps have written to me and have said, well, actually, this actually resonates. This is the first time that I've seen somebody express concerns around this representational framework, and that they've been using that in their own work moving forward, precisely because, as I explore in my research, it's an unsustainable image of the ideal refugee. And as soon as there's one case that disrupts that notion of the ideal refugee, it actually potentially destabilizes precisely those humanitarian and political support systems, which are meant to be keeping the camps afloat. So I think that that's one way of engaging, or one example that came to mind with reference to your really important question, Rick.
Thank you. I think that really shows the complexities and the ethical dilemmas that are at play there. And maybe Julia, do you have anything to?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Rick, and it's really complex. I'm kind of like trying to think about where I go into it, because I think there's so many different dimensions of that. On the one hand, I think, connecting to what Elena's talking about, you have the question of, who you are, right, and what you represent, and when you come and when you start doing field work, wherever that is. In my case, more recently in Amazonian Quilombo communities, which is an ongoing project, and I've the question of who you meet first, you know, and who are you going to be the people that are going to sort of invite you in and, you know, welcome you and host you when you first start doing research. And then, you know, the kind of position that you have within those communities as a result of that invitation, and then what takes place afterwards when you come to meet other people and understand the social processes that are taking place, you know, and how that complexity very often gets lost in a lot of academic kind of work because of this kind of fear of rocking the boat. You know, we're like, well, you know, we're writing about vulnerable communities. We don't want them to be more vulnerable. We want them to have a politically strong position. So there's a kind of like undiscussed almost kind of agreement between academics in a lot of places that they shouldn't talk about the complexities that take place within the field, because otherwise they can make communities more vulnerable. But actually what you end up doing is you create two-dimensional images of situations, and you end up not representing the most vulnerable actually within those communities, because you're not showing that complexity. So I think that at that level, you know, it's something that's really important for us to talk about. The other level that came to me is that really has an impact on the type of work, the content of our work as well. And I think it's really important for us to be as honest as we can, you know, about who we are when we come into the field. And so what that means in terms of who's talking to us and who isn't talking to us, and like actually the people that we have to, you know, work harder to talk to, and why that is and why they don't want to talk to us. And also the fact that you have to respect people's, you know, boundaries and when they don't want to talk to us, but it is something that we have to reflect upon, you know. So in terms of the Maroon communities where I work, you know, obviously the association leaders, who are people who were very active in the demarcation of Maroon land in the 1980s and 1990s in the Brazilian Amazon, were the people who are really interested and who invited me, you know, and who I have very close ties to until today, to talk, you know. And the kind of thing that they wanted to talk about, though, wasn't what other people in the communities want to talk about. You know, like one of the things that, you know, is really important for kind of land demarcation, for example, is memory, right? Is remembering traumatic experiences, right? It's a state demand for remembrance of traumatic experiences that is used in order to legitimize Maroon land and Indigenous land demarcation. And actually, most of the people in the Maroon communities that I worked in didn't want to talk about that. And that's not something that they were interested in, right? When they saw me coming in as a Southern Brazilian person, you know, they imagined that that's what I wanted to talk to them about. And they didn't want to talk to me because of that. And it takes time for you to work and talk to people and say, actually, you know, that's not what my work is about. And there's a lot of kind of really kind of careful dedication, I think, to complexity that has to go into that. And then afterwards thinking about, and this comes the other level, which is how you come to write about it and what actually gets accepted within academic circles and what doesn't, which brings us to the whole question of, you know, the essentialization and romanticization of peoples, Maroons, Indigenous peoples in the Amazon, which takes place persistently in all fields, I think, geography, anthropology, you know, where actually complexity is not something that is very easy to show because you have to constantly hit certain conceptual, you know, marks, especially when you're writing a PhD thesis.
Thanks for that. I just want to quickly remind the audience that that you can raise your hand also to ask a question. You can write them in the box, but you can also raise your hand. So I will just pose one more question, and then I'll go to some of the audience questions. One thing that I think has been since the 80s in anthropology really a strong debate is the kind of question, to what extent do we give space to the participants in our research to maybe co-shape the representations that we make about them? Do we let them read drafts of what we write? Well, maybe not all of them are exactly able to read academic papers, but maybe some other form of communicating back to them. And I think that that question has been on my mind also because yesterday we had a interesting talk in the anthropology material culture section by Sahana Udupa, who's a digital anthropologist, and she made the point that in the digital age, potentially those relations never, it's not like you go home and then the participants of the research are just leaving you alone, right? They will still have an opportunity maybe to write to you on emails or something. So to what extent is there ever, to what extent do you feedback how you will represent the participants in your research to them? And is there a point at which you have to like cut that process, or are there kind of like points where you feel that you need to take your kind of analytical, you know, expertise, maybe even to put it bluntly, to say that there are things which you cannot explain, but yeah, maybe you cannot explain why you represent things in a certain way. Who would like to speak on that? Elena, any thoughts?
Cool, thank you. I'm going to do this. I promised to do a photo bomb. So I'm going to move in. Here we go. So I think that this is a really important question, one it kind of recycles itself. It ebbs and flows. So this notion even of the terminology of our research participants, which is supposedly better than being our interviewees or our informants, etc. But at what time, at what stage, we think about different models of co-production of knowledge and what kinds of knowledge are given a space in research. So on the one hand, I could say that in the refugee hosts research project that I've been leading, we've been working with researchers who themselves have experienced displacement from Syria and from Palestine, and who are themselves not just data collectors or field workers, but are embedded in the research project. They're writing blog pieces, they're speaking at conferences, they are presenting their own insights from the research process, including their own perspectives and their own experiences as academics or as young researchers who've had their academic trajectories disrupted, as it were. So one way is thinking about, well, what does it mean to co-produce with researchers who themselves have experienced displacement? Another question is, well, how do we explore writing as not something that is owned by the researcher, but actually something that is enacted in different ways, whether it's with a pen or whether it's writing as more broadly conceptualized in terms of storytelling or oral histories, etc. So something that is enacted on a daily basis without the research experience being part and parcel of that writing. So we ran a series of writing workshops, again, as part of refugee hosts, and our writer in residence, Fiddian-Qasmiyeh, who was himself born in Badawi refugee camp in North Lebanon, led these workshops, and people came to the workshops not to learn how to write, but at times bringing the poems that they've been writing and have been publishing on Facebook, or with an idea that they wanted to develop and that they wanted to write. So here we have an image of two of our workshop participants, and I am using the word participant there, who are writing in Jordan, not about their displacement experiences, but what it means to create a space and to share that space between people who've been displaced and the residents of the neighborhood where they're writing. So that's one question, is, well, who do we imagine doing the writing, and who owns that writing, and what kind of validity and power do we give to that writing? Do we accept it as knowledge, or do we perceive it as something that has to be analysed by the researcher to give it the power of being knowledge? Is it something to be cited, to be quoted, and then for us to analyze, or does it have power in its own right? And is it knowledge, effectively? Again, one of the key debates that has existed within feminist and decolonial approaches for a long time, whether it's bell hooks, asking the question about, well, who is considered to have significant speech, or who is considered in this context to have significant words that are either spoken or written in this context. So that's a second way of approaching it. And then the third way that I'm just going to kind of pitch this is by quoting from Yusuf Mustafa-Qasmiyeh, who is the co-editor, amongst other things, of is the editor of the Creative Encounter section of the Migration and Society Journal. And in a piece that he's called Engendering Plural Tales, he looks critically at the notion of the voice. And I'll read his words because he reflects on the process of writing as well. So in his approach, he argues that it's important to, I quote, problematize the notion of the voice as it is often perceived and mobilized, a medium offered to those in need of their voices, rather than as a prior state of being that is initiated by and therefore intrinsically belongs to the individual herself. In this vein, to embroider the voice with its own needle is to see the voice within its owner as a given and not to be given, through tracing the thread as it touches the needle eye to go through it, and in so doing, ushering in the embroidering that will come. Indeed, embroidering the voice is writing the intimate, the lived, and the leftovers in life into newer times, as imagined by the writer herself. It is writing without a helping hand from anyone, but rather through continuously returning to the embroidered and what is being embroidered and its tools, notwithstanding how incomplete and fragmentary they are. So that's another way of approaching this notion of writing, and again, problematizing this notion of something that's very strong within refugee studies and also in a lot of research with so-called vulnerable populations, where there is the assumption that voice has to be given. There has to be a space and a role played by the researcher to represent them, rather than seeing people as representing themselves and as documenting and archiving and resisting processes through writing as variously conceptualized. So I will stop photobombing if I can find the exit button to this. Who knows where my exit button is? How do I exit this now? There we go, stop share, brilliant. So over to you, Julia.
Yeah, when you were asking the question, Rick, I was thinking one thing, and now Elena was talking, I think about another thing. So I'm gonna try and speak to both. In terms of the kind of question of feedback, because I think there's a lot of different ways to come at this. One is the question of feedback, right? So it's something that you write by yourself and then you give it back and then you expect people to feed back and then you bring it somewhere else. So there's that. There's like that kind of like process, that kind of movement is one thing. And it's something, you know, that's how I was trained to think about the process of producing anthropological knowledge. Is like you go out there, you live with people for like 2 years, you're in their face constantly, and then you leave and then you write and then you come back and they're going to give feedback or they're going to accept your thesis. And this idea, this crazy idea of what it means to, you know, have a conversation with someone, because we're talking about people who, since I was started doing anthropology, are interlocutors, right? They're not participants. As if that is enough in terms of producing interlocutors, you know, that's how I was trained. I think it's something that for me is, you know, has always been really difficult to think about. Like even before I did my PhD, when I was working with street educators and street children, and, you know, thinking about how, you know, my work was going to be perceived, not by the street children and street educators, but by the NGOs, you know, that I was critiquing basically in my work, and how that was going to be kind of taken on board. And it wasn't taken on board. I was kind of cut off because of that by the NGOs, not by the street educators and street children. So there's a kind of like, there's that question. But then there's also, you know, the question that what we're training our students to think about more now is the idea of collaboration, right? And I think that that's something that we have to be very careful with, right? Because I think that there's this kind of idea that collaboration, that term kind of is some kind of ethical panacea for all of the problems that are involved in producing knowledge. And, you know, we see time and again with people writing about collaboration and how it fails and how people make mistakes and how there's heartbreak involved, you know. And so I think it's really important for us to keep in mind that there is no, you know, solution to this very difficult relationship and to this complex problem of knowledge production and the different power dynamics that are involved in knowledge production. I don't think, you know, there's one kind of single kind of process that is going to resolve everything. And I think it's really important for us to keep that in mind, because then we can also keep an eye on what we're doing and be honest with the mistakes that we make, which is something that we don't have a lot of room to talk about, particularly when we're writing PhD theses, the mistakes and the messiness, you know, that is part of the work of doing field work, particularly. So I think that that is, you know, that's really important for us to talk about. The other side of this, and this relates more to what Elena was saying as well, is that, and also to what you were talking about in terms of digital kind of like, and when you're at, I mean, I honestly, WhatsApp is like, I'm always talking to people from the field, you know, it's as if, and they're in the Amazon now. When I was living there was no Wi-Fi in these communities, but in the last few years, there's Wi-Fi in, you know, quite isolated Amazonian communities. So I'm constantly talking to my friends and people that I'm working with there. And so that adds a different dimension to, you know, what is possible in terms of conversations and thinking about work and asking questions and thinking about cooperation, collaboration, however we want to talk about it, that I think is really important. And also I think thinking about, you know, when it is important for us to respect the end of relationships, which is not something that we also, you know, talk about very much. And it's something that I think is really important ethically for us to consider, is when people actually are like, you know what, I don't want to talk to you anymore. And the boundaries that we have to accept in that sense. So I think that's really important. And I think it's also something that's important. The digital is really important, particularly as I work with, you know, young Maroon people, a lot of them who don't know how to read and write very well, you know, and who, if I gave them my thesis, they would be like, you know, this is meaningless to me. Like it doesn't do anything for me. And so how do we find different ways of talking about what we're working on and thinking about what we want to do together, and using digital spaces in order to do that, I think is really, really important now.
Great. I think the word of caution about collaboration, but at the same time pointing at the potential, that's really important to find the balance there. So we're now going to move to a couple of questions that have been posed in the Q&A, and maybe the people who ask them want to ask them themselves, but I will now give the mic to Victoria, who will pose some of the questions, or at least one of them.
Thank you, Rick. And yeah, just a reminder for everyone that has written in the Q&A, feel free to raise your hand if you'd prefer to you know, pose your question yourself. But for now, I will read out a question from Caetano, which came sort of at the beginning of the conversation. And they say, as a Brazilian researcher also working in a UK university, I agree with Julia's initial remarks, and with her comments and examples about the involvement of certain areas of the academy with governmental instances in Brazil. At the same time, one sees a great deal of tension in Brazil, in that there's a relationship between the academy and the current government, if such a word can be used to describe it, and parts of Brazilian society, especially considering the denialist stance of Bolsonaro. It might be slightly off topic, but I was wondering if we're not also witnessing a certain representation of academic knowledge and work that actively seeks to undermine it, and in Brazil, underfund it, deconstruct it, which can be very problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the situation in Brazil for anthropologists generally, and particularly anthropologists working in the Amazon region with indigenous people and maroon communities, is really, really problematic and really dangerous to some degrees. You know, Bolsonaro government has, you know, persistently attacked the work of anthropologists and other academics in Brazil, and is, you know, actively undermining research by taking away funding from researchers, and that is a political act. You know, when we're talking about the involvement of anthropologists with the state in relation to land demarcation, I think it's important to emphasize, you know, as problematic as that has been, you know, these are incredible, you know, victories for a lot of the indigenous peoples that we're talking about, maroon communities. And, you know, that is being completely attacked and broken apart by Bolsonaro's government, and anthropologists, other academics have been threatened with, you know, legal action, with imprisonment. They're persistently being attacked within lecture theatres by students who are undermining them from that sense, because they're coming from kind of in a very kind of oppositional kind of like, and attacking mode, and even some kind of stories of, you know, police that are kind of going into, which kind of harks back to kind of, you know, the military dictatorship and what was taking place in the military dictatorship in Brazil, in terms of, you know, having spies within lecture theatres in Brazilian universities, which is something that did take place, you know, on an everyday question. And this is all coming back now within Brazilian universities, you know, and I have colleagues who have been, you know, vehemently attacked by students and their parents, you know, students who have like recorded people talking about indigenous rights and things like that, and who have been attacked publicly because of that. So I think there is a definite undermining of academic work and research taking place, which is really, really dangerous in itself in the Brazilian context.
Great. Caetano's question was somewhat Brazil specific, but if you want to, Elena, if you want to add something, you can of course speak, or shall we move on to the next question? Yeah. Okay. We have a question, a raised hand from Ting. Could you introduce yourself, describe yourself, and share your question with us? I think you'll be on mute now.
Oh, hi. Thank you for the speaker's excellent talk. I just want to ask, when it comes to publication, do you have any suggestions for like prevent people like small refugee communities to be identified? Or
I'm sorry, we cannot hear you very clearly. I'm not able to hear your question.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, my question is when it comes to publication, I was wondering to speaker how you can protect the identity of the interviewee, or like either concern about or from them to be identified, because it's very small community.
Mm-hmm. I'll just repeat the question. The question was, how do you protect the identities of your participants when you are, or interlocutors, etc., when dealing with a small community? Elena, do you have any thoughts on that?
Thanks, Ting, for your question. So there are many different ways that researchers have approached this. Some approaches have just assumed that researchers know best, and that researchers know when people face risks and are likely to face risks in future, and they can sometimes use blanket approaches such as anonymization and erasing specific characteristics or markers of identity They can change place names, etc. So that if it's a small community, then you change the name and the description of the location of that community, of that village, of that refugee camp, for example, and you do not use the real name, you do not necessarily use the country of origin, the age, any identifying markers that could lead to that person being known by a third person. Other people ask interlocutors, collaborators, the people that they are speaking with, if they want to choose a name of their own choice. So for example, what would in literary terms be known as a pen name. So somebody who is called Muhammad and they choose that actually they would be like to be known as Abu Yad, for example. And that's the name that they will identify themselves in when they potentially read or see the output, whether it's a blog or an article or a chapter, and they can say, ah, that's me, even though it isn't my real name, and they can identify themselves. And in other instances, people want their names to be known, and it's a political act at times, and it's an opportunity for people to make their own decisions on these matters. So rather than researchers assuming that they know best, or ethical clearance boards assuming that they know when people are in vulnerable positions, then these are decisions that can be made collectively, or at least in conversation. It becomes, in the case of humanities research, where interlocutors may be writing field entries, diary entries, they might be writing poems or short stories, they might be photographers, they might be filmmakers, they might be involved in different forms of knowledge production. It sometimes is quite complicated with ethics boards to convince them that people are the producers of that knowledge and have the right to be named as the owners and producers of that knowledge. And that can sometimes lead to long and drawn out conversations around the right to protect people's ownership of that production of knowledge themselves. Julie, I'm sure that you have great insights on this.
Yeah, I think, you know, that's the main thing with, I mean, certainly when I was working more with street children and street educators, you know, that was a kind of like a certain situation where, you know, I found myself, you know, there were a lot of illegal kind of actions taking place, you know, constantly on a day-to-day basis. And there's a certain kind of consideration that we have to have for protecting our interlocutors, particularly when we're talking about children and young people. That, you know, one of what I found was the way that I found of dealing with that in my master's dissertation, which in Brazil is quite a big document, was by, you know, choosing because they all had nicknames anyway, right? So no, you don't know any of their names anyway because they already have their own nicknames, but also creating new nicknames for them, and so sort of also not identifying where we were meeting on the street, because in Rio the streets are divided by different factions, so you can identify what children you're talking about by the streets that you're meeting them in. So there's all those kinds of considerations that you can have in that context. But working in Maroon communities, you know, there's a kind of a very different situation. A lot of the people that I work with want to be named. They want their names to be there. They want to be made visible, particularly because, as I said before, you know, there's this kind of sense that people don't know that there are Maroon communities in the Amazon, and part of their motivation talking to me is actually, we want to be visible, we want to be there. But then also there are, you know, situations that take place in the field that people would rather, you know, you not name them. And so I think there has to be a kind of case-by-case basis when you're coming to doing your writing up, and you have people's permissions to write about those situations, but they're like, I don't want my name to be there, but I want to tell you this thing, you know, then those are things that you have to talk with your interlocutors with and make that decision together. But as Elena said, there is this kind of blanket kind of anonymization taking place in ethical boards in the UK at the moment, which makes that process quite difficult, and which is really problematic, because if we're talking about, you know, the co-production of knowledge, if we can't include people's names and they want their names to be there, how can we then say that we are you know, pursuing that really.
Great. I think, yeah, let's move on to another one of the questions from the, yeah, Victoria will ask another one of the questions that was asked the Q&A.
Yes, so there is a question from an anonymous attendee who asks, how do we negotiate financial relations with our research participants, which is one of the most immediate and often useful forms of support a researcher can do?
Who would like to go first? Julia? Yep.
I'm happy to go first. This is a really important question. And actually, I think this is one of these kinds of questions that, you know, we never talk about, or certainly when I was, you know, training to go to the field as PhD students, something that we didn't talk about explicitly and for long enough, you know, to think about what our positions are. You know, as you say, we're often when we come in, particularly in where I have worked, you know, the fact that you're being paid to go there and do research and you have this research money is something that is very clear to a lot of the people that you're working with. And particularly when you're working with communities where, you know, participating in collective life in part takes place by the way, in the way that people share their salaries with each other, right? So that's something that's part of the day-to-day life. You know, there aren't that many salaried positions in the communities that I work in, and the people who do have salaries, they will buy stuff for the household and for extended families and for the whole community often because other people don't have salaried positions. And as a researcher coming in who obviously has a much bigger kind of you know, amount of money, a much larger amount of money than all of the salaried positions in the community put together, you know, it begs the question, you know, what kind of financial commitment, how are you going to negotiate that? Who are you going to negotiate it with? You know, and I think that that has to be something that we are trained to think about and to implement when we're, on the one hand, thinking about talking to people about starting research, right, and who we're talking to, and on the other hand, when we're doing field work on a day-to-day and monthly basis, and also on a long-term basis, you know, in terms of you've got something out of this, so that we're not reproducing purely extractive relationships with our interlocutors in the field, but that actually we're bringing back to the communities and the projects that they have in mind for their communities. I think it's really important to think about community-led projects, you know, in that sense, but you are always going to get individual people, individual families who are going to come to you and say, look, I need to go into town to go to take my child to hospital. I don't have the money to do that. Can you please lend me the money? Are you going to say no? You're not going to help get a child to hospital? It's these constant kind of ethical dilemmas that come up in the field site that I think is really important for us to talk about, because they will take place always.
Elena, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That this is considered, again, if you're going through your ethics board, this is considered to be a problematic question when it comes to the social sciences and a lot of the humanities as well, which is, it's almost as if money sullies the purity of the research encounter, and that people aren't really telling you the truth because they want to talk to you and they want to enhance knowledge, but rather they are somehow tricking you, or they are doing it for the money, or that money makes them vulnerable because it makes them have to do the research with you. So these are the assumptions that exist, which don't necessarily reflect the realities that go through people's own decision-making processes in terms of whether they do or they don't want to participate, whether they do or they don't want to tell you the so-called truth, how they wish to represent themselves in those processes. In an ideal world, I think we should pay people for the time that they are spending talking to us. And that will obviously also depend on what resources we have. So again, if we are coming in from the outside with funding, then that's quite different from being a local researcher who has been displaced from Syria and potentially has limited resources of their own in the community where they are already doing their research. Again, it depends what our model is, what our starting point is of who the researcher is and what kind of resources are there. But for many people, research is a very violent process. It is extractive. It is a process that is to be viewed with contempt to an extent. And for other people, it's something that is an extension of having a conversation in a cafe or on the street corner, and it's a continuation of social encounters. But from my perspective, it's people's time. People should be remunerated for the time that they're spending with us, but the ethics board will find that highly problematic. And you will really have to explain clearly how that is not compromising the integrity of the research process and is not putting people at risk. So yes, it's a highly context specific issue and something that needs to be discussed more frankly, absolutely, in research training and in recognizing the power inequalities and the different power that is accrued through the research process, the way that we build our careers on other people's words, rather than engaging critically with that process of knowledge production.
That links really well to what I was going to suggest as a last question, where I'm kind of inspired by one of the comments made by Jennifer, who writes that humanities scholars are perpetually measured against empirical metrics that favor research tied to government policy, and having worked with resettled refugees to redesign housing in Australian cities, unless the outcome is measurable, universities tend to ignore results that are generated. So following from that, as a final question before we slowly wrap up, I would like to ask how the different like perhaps career stages in academia can put you in different positions towards the communities that you work with. Like if a young emerging scholar is going to spend all their time on activism, let's say, or advocacy work, or publishing things in outlets that are not necessarily part of that metrics machine, it might be very difficult for them to find a permanent job in academia, but at the same time, they may have ethical commitments. And so how do you balance those two things? I'm very curious if you have anything to share on that. Julia, do you want to go first?
Yeah, it's a hard one. So, you know, when I finished doing fieldwork, when I was still doing my PhD, I spent, I think, it was the longest period of time since I started my research in the Amazonian communities, not going there, which was a period of about 3 years, because I came back to the UK first of all, and then I went and finally ended up writing up a lot of my thesis in Rio, and because I found it quite hard to kind of be there and write at the same time. I felt like I needed to have that space, but at the same time, you know, we're constantly kind of talking to each other on the phone and talking about what was happening in the communities and talking about future work together and things like that. I think that these things just get more and more difficult as you progress, because, you know, you have the PhD and that's an enormous, you know, pressure and it's difficult. But then what you don't know is that after that, you become a postdoc or a teaching fellow or an early career lecturer. And, you know, you have literally no time for anything at all, you know, especially at the moment. I've got like, you know, I get something like 100 emails a day or something to answer. And at the same time, you know, I'm kind of, you know, talking to people on the Erepecoru River about projects that we're running together, and future projects that we might be thinking about doing together. And it is a really tricky balance. I think the main thing is to keep lines of communication open, like, and if people want to talk to you, to be present, you know, and to also think together about, you know, what those relationships are going to become together, you know, not just yourself in your mind by yourself, like, what am I going to do about this, you know, but actually how you engage in constant conversations with people. And I find that, you know, the people I work with, they want to talk to me, and they want to, for now, you know, they want to talk to me, they want to carry on working with me. And, you know, that's something that I have to keep in mind constantly. And it is part of the work that I do, you know, and it's always there, and it's always very present for me, particularly when I'm talking like in an event like this about them, and you know, in a lecture theatre, and I'm talking about my research, they're always present, they're always there with me. So the idea that you somehow cut off, you know, those people, to me is a very alien idea. Like, I can't really contemplate it.
Elena?
Thank you. I feel that this distinction between the personal, the political, and the academic is, again, an arbitrary one, and one that has been fermented by particular disciplinary perspectives as encouraged by particular people. So there are different ways of engaging in knowledge production and in actions of different types, noting that also inaction is itself a form of, you know, a decision that you've made for different reasons, and that sometimes inaction is the most ethical response in some contexts, or in many contexts. So I think that if we engage carefully in exploring those relationships between the personal, the political, and the academic, then there doesn't have to be those silos. It doesn't have to be you relinquish activism in order to pursue your academic career, or or vice versa. You relinquish the academic to ensure that you can be true to your activist principles. There are different ways of navigating these situations, and absolutely the privilege that I have as a professor versus an emerging scholar, or you know, an MPhil student, etc., who has so many more bureaucratic hoops and insecurities to navigate, you know, is incredibly important in these contexts. And what I would really encourage us all is to continue thinking critically around these structural inequalities and the barriers that prevent people from making their own decisions and enacting them themselves. So when we do think about decisions and activism and the actions or inactions that we engage with, to think, how does this actually support the work of people who are already doing it, rather than seeing ourselves as having to act from outside, and having that ethical obligation, as it were, to represent or to give voice or to speak on behalf of. So what are we doing to challenge the structural inequalities and the structural barriers, which are something that we can challenge and deconstruct and destabilize. So I think potentially that's one entry point to that, and that is consistent with critical scholarship, rather than antithetical to it.
Yeah,
Great, thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to say one more thing. I won't take long, but in relation to that, I think that there's also a kind of, I don't know, I feel like sometimes talking about it, you know, it's sort of like I'm talking about, you know, my research in relation to my academic career, you know, as if these things are kind of like dissociated, and at the same time, the activism that takes place in my research, as if that there is no activism taking place within the institutional frame, and the activism that we have to also pursue within our institutions, I think, is really, really important, and reflects that activism that takes place elsewhere, and has to reflect that critically, as Elena said. You know, we are in institutions in the UK, as we all know, and that's why we're having this event. you know, where people are excluded, you know, where there isn't enough diversity in our departments. And that is something that, you know, we can write about, but apparently we can't enact within our departments, you know. And so that is something that is really, really important for us to think about in terms of where activism takes place as well, you know, and something that has to take place on an everyday basis. And it's not just in terms of when people, you know, kind of bring up particular problems, but it's something that is constantly present and has to be constantly present in our acts as academics within universities.
Great. Thank you both so much, Julia and Elena. I was going to ask both of you for a closing statement, but I think your answers to this question are really, they're so forward-looking and really inspiring and helpful to think through this issue. So in being aware of time, I think I could just stop here. So thanks so much to both of you for sharing your insights. I will now give the mic to Alice, who will speak on behalf of the paper team.
Thank you, and thanks Elena, Julia, and Rick. As I'm about to do my ethics forms this week, I have paused for thought now, so I found, yeah, a really stimulating conversation, and thank you so much. Yes, I'm Alice. As a visual descriptor, I'm a white woman with faded pink hair and blue eyes. I'm wearing a multicolored jumper, and my pronouns are she, her. So just a final few comments before closing up. Julia has asked us to share a GoFundMe she's involved with Kukilamo, and I'll read from their website. For over 200 years, Amazonian Key Lombo families in the Trombetas River Basin in Orishima, Brazil, descended from Africans and Afro-descendants who found refuge from enslavement in the rainforest, have been fighting to maintain their communities against constant attacks from state and corporate, racial and environmental violence. As Francisco Hugo de Souza from the Zwauri community explains in a recent audio message, until today we live there organizing ourselves, fighting against the large-scale projects that exist in this region, which is why we want everyone to help us so that we can combat all of these problems in our communities and also work to develop our communities without destroying the forest. This project supports their efforts to begin a seedling and reforestation program, carpentry workshop and mini market, with the aim of supporting sustainable community production, preventing indebtedness, and reducing families' needs to make long, expensive and dangerous journeys by boat into town. We encourage you to donate whatever you can. We're also asking you to engage with a few of Elena's free open access works, including her introduction to a special issue of Migration and Society entitled Recentering the South in Studies of Migration. We'd also like to point you towards two projects entitled Local Community Experiences of and Responses to Displacement from Syria, aka Refugee Hosts, and the Southern-led Responses to Displacement from Syria project. These projects and the open access works are closely related to all the themes we've been discussing today, and how the speakers have discussed how these can be utilized in our research praxis. And lastly, we're excited to say that Yosef Fiddian-Qasmiyeh new poetry collection, Writing the Camp, has been selected by the Poetry Book Society Spring 2021 recommendation. It draws from his experience of the Badawi refugee camp in Lebanon. To quote the publisher, the poetry moves beyond the observational into a philosophical meditation on the existential nature of place. So all of these links should be available in the chat, so please have a look and share your support. And many thanks again, and hand over to Emily to close.
Thanks, Alice. So as a visual description, I'm a white woman with brown, short, curly hair. I'm wearing a white top with green, yellow, and black stripes, and I'm in my kitchen with pink tiles as my background. My pronouns are she, her. And we want to just say thank you so much, Elena, Julia, and Rick, for your time and your engagement. It's been such a fantastic discussion. And just to sort of round off the series, we've received incredibly positive feedback about all of the events, which we feel is really a testament to the importance of the insights and the provocations from all of the speakers who've joined us from the very beginning. So we really hope that it's also a sign of the possibility for change. As a team, we'll now be running a couple of workshops at UCL next term to think through how to embed learnings from these seminars into individual projects and the department's teaching of research methods. We'll then be working within the department to implement this into pedagogical programs. We'll share our reflections and outcomes online, and we'll circulate with those who've been involved in the series to make sure that it's all really fully transparent. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, especially in the middle of a pandemic and across the multiple time zones that I know everyone has been sort of beaming into Zoom from. It's really wonderful to see so many people from all around the world. So thank you. Have a really lovely evening or day or afternoon, wherever you are. And we hope that our paths will cross again soon. Bye-bye. Thanks.